I love the theme of this conference. And originally I thought I would take this talk in a bit of a different direction, but thank you. Every time I thought about it, I kept getting pulled back to a bigger, more general picture. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about picks up nicely with what Richard Kilminster was saying last night in his concluding remarks about the potential for Elias's work to provide a general theory with quite profound and broad applications. So I want to begin by sharing an experience I had this past summer where I attended a homesteading conference. There's this network of activist farmers in Southeast Ohio that's been growing recently and planning a lot of events. And in this area, it's so interesting. It's in the southeast part of the state, which is part of the Appalachians. And so the land is really lush. The people are really poor. There's Trump signs decorating the countryside. But this group of farmers has been just doing such interesting work, largely because two of the folks that live among them, kind of the elders among the group, wrote a book a few years ago that has gained some notoriety in farming circles, homesteading circles. And so they have been mentors to these younger farmers in the area. And they've been doing a lot of events lately. So I went to this conference last summer, and because they've become a little bit famous, people from all over the country came there. It was really interesting. And at this conference, over meals and coffee and just hanging out, I got to know a couple dozen of the participants who were really diverse in age, ethnicity, political, educational, philosophical, backgrounds. Maybe not philosophical, I don't know that. Professional backgrounds for sure. But one thing they had in common was this general sense that they expressed in various ways that something in the balance of the world had recently shifted, and not for the better. And on the evening of the last day of the conference, the participants were invited to tea at the home of the two authors that I mentioned. And some folks sat in the dining room. I have no idea what they talked about. The rest of us sat in the living room in this really intimate space, sipping our tea on couches, chairs, on the floor. And Beth, one of the hosts, a really great conversationalist, she kicked off the conversation by asking us what had brought us to this conference. And in addition to the various practical motivations people shared about what they wanted to learn and what they had planned to do, all of them, to a person, also expressed a sense of unease that nagged at them about society and the future. And the last woman to speak said simply, "Something's happening, something's gone wrong." And that statement drew unanimous agreement from everyone in forms of nods and yeps and amens. And in just a few words, she seemed to summarize what people were feeling at a gut level. And Beth followed up with a question, "Why do you think that is?" And I listened because I'm a sociologist, undercover spy all the time. And so I was listening carefully as participants shared wide-ranging theories and concerns about what was happening. And they talked about the expanding role of technology, that families had fallen apart, that government's gotten too big, the economic challenges of globalization, the loss of religion, and with a conspiracy theory or two sprinkled in. Most striking to me was that as the sharing peaked and the conversation reached its natural conclusion, no greater clarity or shared understanding had really been achieved. And it seemed almost as if everyone just kind of drew their stream of thought back into themselves, mostly unchanged. There were some transitional shrugs and sighs, and then the conversation forked, turning on one side of the room to pie recipes and on the other side to the best brands of fencing. And although this may seem like an unusual setting for an academic to be hanging out in, this was not an isolated experience. Over the past 20 years, I've been privy to conversations like this in all kinds of different settings: academic conferences, family gatherings, skills workshops, meetings with religious groups, with people of wide-ranging political and cultural views. And while the details of what people say vary, the basic conclusion remains the same, which is that people sense that something is off, something in society has gone wrong, only most don't understand what's happening and couldn't explain why. Certainly, my view as an American is very limited, but based on what I see and hear, I think this holds true more widely. After all, daily we witness unraveling at ecological, societal, and individual levels. We see floods, wildfires, and droughts in the news or in our backyards. We encounter statistics about greenhouse gases, species extinction, rainforest disappearing, and more. With regard to society, we see aggression, invasion, and violence in some nations, while others seem to be irreconcilably divided. We're aware of grinding poverty and stark inequalities, and the looming threat of nuclear war. As for individuals, we show ever-increasing rates of stress, depression, and anxiety. All manner of chronic diseases continue to rise, detracting from quality and length of life and burdening national economies. And the ever-multiplying demands on our time and attention leave many of us overwhelmed. And most people think of these issues as somewhat unrelated or as caused by things that are totally outside of our control. And the tendency is to deal with symptoms as they arise, cut out the tumor, subdue the aggressor, capture the carbon, but never really addressing the root causes. Let's see if I can find the arrow. Pardon me. There we go. In short, people are reacting to these blind, uncontrolled processes which they can sense but cannot see. The task of sociology, Norbert Elias tells us, is to make these processes more accessible to human understanding, to help people orient themselves in them, to see them, and especially to see our role in creating them. This is the key, he argues, to finally achieving a greater degree of control over these processes. And my main thesis is in keeping with this, that in not seeing the real origins of our troubles more clearly, in relying on fantasy to explain what's happening, whether out of ignorance or willfulness, we are left confused and largely helpless to respond to problems or mitigate harm. What I aim to show today is how a sociological understanding of long-term processes can help on both counts. I'll discuss a theoretical framework meant to convey and promote this kind of understanding, derived from Elias's work and introduced in my first book, Beyond the Knowledge Crisis. This framework views social processes from a very high level of synthesis, allowing the necessary big picture view in both time and space. So in what follows, I'm going to cover a lot of ground in a short time from a vast distance. So I hope you can forgive what may in places appear as superficiality. And I hope that the pieces I've chosen to bring together will make sense. You'll have to let me know at the end. So let's begin by defining our terms. What is the fantasy reality continuum? So fantasy, using some simple definitions here, knowing that they're much more complicated as we've heard, fantasy is the faculty and product of imagining, especially things that are impossible or improbable. So here you're looking at a jackalope, which is a fictional animal of North American folklore, described as a jackrabbit with antelope horns. It's even more fantastical because those actually look like reindeer antler and not antelope horns. But reality refers to the world or state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to our ideas or fantasies about them. Now, our ideas about reality will never be reality nor perfectly represent it, but they can be more or less congruent to the actual state of things. That is, approximately equal to, a good fit with, near equivalence in shape or form. As humans, we must use concepts and symbols to make sense of and explain our world. Some explanations are more congruent with reality, some less so. This is to be expected and not necessarily a bad thing. Of those which are less aligned, they can be neutral, or they can impact people to varying degrees in ways positive and negative. Take the sun, for example. It's captivated humanity's imagination since the dawn of our species. Countless legends show how civilizations created fascinating stories to explain what it was and what it did. In an example of what are mostly neutral symbols and tales around the world, the sun is transported across the sky daily in various kinds of vehicle. This type of fantasy is rather harmless in that it can't impact the sun's activity, a phenomenon we can't control. But an example of a fantasy that has negative impacts would be an understanding of the sun as a god who must be appeased. This was the rationale for Aztec human sacrifice, which they saw as a matter of survival. They had to feed the sun god human hearts and blood to sustain him so that he could continue waging war against darkness, because in their view, if darkness won, the world would end. Among examples of positive effects of such tales are beliefs about the solstice, the day the sun stands still, which we're rapidly approaching here in the Northern Hemisphere. In traditional societies, this was known to be a very lean time, and around the world, there are solstice stories about kind beings who help people through this difficult time of year. And communal celebrations of this event acted as cultural reinforcements of social bonds and networks of mutual sharing and support. Over the course of recent centuries, we've developed what appears to be a much more reality-congruent understanding of the sun, one that aligns more closely with the actual state of things. So from a modern scientific point of view, we see the sun as a star, one of about 100 billion in our galaxy, and the center of our solar system. We know that the sun is the major source of energy powering our planet. It drives climate and ocean currents and makes life possible through plant photosynthesis, which is the foundation of every food web. This is a far cry from chariots and hungry gods. We can see similar historical and cultural variation in our understanding of other things, like what causes illness or health, about birth and death and weather and so on. But before getting into our contemporary fantasies, I want to add one important caveat here. Reality congruent knowledge does not necessarily mean more scientific or more modern. Conclusions based on prolonged observation, imaginative and unscientific though they be, can actually align better with reality than some modern views. Myth, for example, though often equated with fantasy, can represent congruent knowledge and wisdom at a high level of synthesis. Properly understood as that which never happened, but is always happening, and wielded well, myth can contribute to a culture's long-term sustainability as it plays a crucial role in conveying fundamental truths. Imagination, then, although we associate it with fantasy, is not restricted to it. In fact, imagination is essential to all knowledge construction, as are observation, explanation, and other human capacities which can be put into service in either direction. And I know we've talked about the continuum as not being aligned, so picture this as a circle that meets somewhere on the ends. In any case, sometimes a lack of reality congruence can't be helped. It's a matter of historical circumstance. We can only know what we can know at a given time and place in human history. But sometimes it can, like now. Despite our having knowledge, which can actually help us understand and respond to unfolding crises, somewhat counterintuitively, we're seeing people increasingly embrace fantasy-based explanations to our detriment. This raises many interesting sociological questions, not least of which is, what's going on? Which I think inspired this conference. In keeping with the conference theme of bringing social scientific understanding of long-term processes to bear on shifts in the fantasy-reality continuum, we'll see how the theoretical framework I mentioned can shed light on this and other interesting questions, like the role of fantasy in creating the dangers that most concern us, and some of the ways it has obscured our understanding of them, and thus our ability to meaningfully respond. I'll discuss the framework briefly here while answering these questions, though not necessarily in this order. And I'm going to begin here with this last point, especially as it applies to fantasy in academia. So as you heard, my academic background is in sociology, and especially sociological theory. But for the past almost 20 years, I've been immersed in the wider interdisciplinary world of what I call socio-environmental studies, where the burning question has been, why? Despite everything we know about Earth systems and the problems we're causing, have we been unable to do much of anything about them? And they have long understood that the bottleneck is us. And the refrain is, if only we could better understand the human dimension of our predicament and put that together with our knowledge from the natural sciences, then we'd be in business. From this general position emerge two main demands. So One is that we need a framework that can integrate knowledge from across the disciplines, especially across the natural and social sciences. So here's just a small sample of statements to that effect. I'm just going to give you a moment to skim through those. Secondly, we see a plea for help in understanding social change, how it works, and how to make it happen. In response to declarations of the need for immediate transformative social changes to avert the worst of potential disaster, researchers understandably went looking for a theory and discovered that we really don't have one, though very few in American sociology would concede the point, and very few actually even recognize it as a question. But for years, I encountered these demands in different venues, listserv conversations, papers, talks, books, all over the place. I encountered these kinds of demands on a weekly basis, at least. And it puzzled me because, to my mind, answers to these questions already existed, but they were going unrecognized somehow. And the trouble, I realized eventually, was the absence of a widely accepted foundational theory, a reliable theory of human social processes that was grounded in biophysical reality. And behind this absence, it turned out, were a couple of mega fantasies in the form of bad mental models, which precluded any such reliable understanding. Among other things, one involves the relationship between individuals and society, and long-standing delusions of them as somehow independent from and opposed to one another. And this one's really only possible because of another fairy tale, which is that we are separate from the environment. This idea, though obviously false to anyone who takes a moment to consider it, continues to pervade scientific thinking and popular thought. So here just a small sampling of many, many, many examples of this in academic publications, showing how we continue to imagine these phenomena as separate spheres of activity to which connections must be added. That's hence all of the arrows that we draw there. And this remains the case, no matter the discipline or how elaborate the diagrams get. So here's a famous one. I know it's hideous. This one is attempting to depict Earth system processes and how they relate to human activities. And please pardon the blurriness of this diagram, but really the only thing you need to know is that everything there pertains to Earth systems except that small oval in the bottom right, which is called human activities. I would stand up and point to it, but I'm going to stay by the mic. So, not wanting to be left out of the action, social scientists came up with their own version, and they tried to capture social processes and how they related to the environment. And same thing. All of the arrows and boxes above pertain to social processes, and the environment lives in a green box at the bottom of the diagram. This common view is summed up beautifully in a book called Panarchy, where the authors of one chapter observe that there still seem to be two separate audiences in this area of studies. Natural scientists who want to include in their world model a box called people, and social scientists interested in resource issues who wish to include in their model a box called natural environment. Now, as you can see, I'm showing you examples in real life, so this is not a straw man, but I must add, I suspect most people working in this space really do understand things better. But without a means to convey that understanding, we unwittingly reinforce these erroneous mental models, which perpetuates our incapacity to explain long-term processes and therefore to take well-informed action to correct course. And that's exactly what's been happening. I think we can do better. So recall the two demands in socio-environmental studies. Every time I came across these, which I told you was very frequently, a thought nagged at me. And I thought, I think I can help. But there was a persistent response to that in me, which was, who the hell am I to claim such a thing? Fortunately, my working class practicality won out, and I just felt certain that the general theory I saw hidden in Elias's work could meet both of these demands and thus provide the understanding of human social processes that we needed. So I set out to articulate that theory and develop a means to more readily convey it. One first step was to devise a more realistic picture of humans' place in the world by actually putting us in it rather than oddly next to it. And this takes us from an erroneous picture of society and environment as separate to a properly hierarchical picture of emergent levels of dynamic phenomena. Implicit in this is an understanding that life emerges from physical phenomena to constitute a distinct level with a greater degree of complexity, and that human social phenomena emerge from biophysical conditions to constitute a third distinct level. This simple move produces a radically different mental model. In it, there's not even the possibility of separation because we are biophysical conditions, while at the same time, we are distinct phenomena acting on them. Among its many benefits, this more accurate model lends itself to a helpful set of fundamental sociological principles, highlighting the biological basis of our sociality, our capacity and our need for learning, and our inherent interdependence. Having a small set of principles in place rather than an endless list of variables thought to be significant not only helps to solve a number of old puzzles in sociology, it also provides the makings of the theory that we need. So I discuss all this in the book and work out a way to package and more easily convey this theory, for better or worse, so far what I've been calling the socio-environmental synthesis framework. If we imagine looking at this emergent model at an undefined moment in time from above and from a great distance, we make out key categories of phenomena, biophysical conditions, including the matter, energy, processes, both given and made, comprising the setting and stuff of our lives and which we ourselves embody. Figurations, dynamic patterns of bonds of social interdependence. Habitus, the system of socially learned schemas, that sense of second nature that forms and is expressed within particular biophysical and figurational conditions. And the impacts of human activities, which are largely the expression of habitus, on other people and the world. And what is more, we detect a basic pattern among them. So this is how it looks in the book. And I know it's kind of boring, I'm sorry, but what I lack in graphic design skills, I tried to make up for in conveying a theory that was both comprehensive and parsimonious. But for today, I wanted to add a little life to this picture as I discuss the basic pattern. So first, some color. And a reminder that at any given moment in time, the processes represented here in swirling motion, because we want to remember that they are always happening simultaneously, albeit at different rates, on different levels and scales, perceived from different vantage points. And yet, there is a kind of order of conditioning influences. From the biophysical conditions, which social phenomena necessarily emerge from, are made of, depend on, operate within, affect, and are affected by, to the patterns of social bonds of interdependence which develop within them, to the individuals born into and growing up within those webs of relations and the society-specific second natures they acquire as a result, to the individual and collective expressions of habitus, to the impacts those expressions have on other people in the world, and the ways in which those influence subsequent biophysical conditions, figurations, and the rest over time, creating the conditions within which future moments necessarily emerge, and so on. The point is that in properly situating human social phenomena in a larger and more accurate picture, especially in their biophysical bases, this framework enables us to understand so much more clearly. Like the role of that fantasies play in the creation of ecological, societal, and individual dangers in the first place, and how they sustain them and even make them worse. So let's begin by using the framework to examine the phenomenon of the fantasy reality continuum, first situating it in its biophysical conditions of human bodies. The capacity to fantasize, to imagine and contemplate what's not here or now, what's not probable or perhaps ever possible, is an evolutionary adaptation, and as far as we know, a distinctly human trait, as is the capacity to distinguish fantasy from reality, which is crucial to normal human functioning. On a moment-to-moment basis, this capacity generates in us pictures and scenarios which are variously benign, helpful, or harmful. So I bet if I asked you to imagine that in my left hand sits a white chicken. Can you see it in your mind's eye? I bet you can. Let's turn it into a red apple. For most of us, this is pretty easy to do. At the drop of a hat, we regularly drum up fantasies, mostly harmless. This capacity can also help us do great things like plan for the future, invent, solve problems, make great art, create myths or sociological theories, which help us to better grasp reality. And of course, it can also impel us to do harmful things at different scales with different effects, ranging from mild to catastrophic. It's important to note here that all evolutionary adaptations can also work against us, especially under certain conditions, and that's the important point here. Take, for instance, the innate preference for sweet flavors. This instinct pairs well with the sweet mother's milk baby's need and an environment where carbohydrate-rich foods were rare. But since the advent of processed sugar and grain, and especially today where ultra-sweet foods are ubiquitous, this propensity has become a dangerous liability. Our stress response system offers another example. It evolved to equip us with the energy and focus we need to fight or flee from discrete momentary harms. But when the stressors we perceive are chronic and long-lasting, like commuter traffic, tension at work, poverty, our physiological systems get overtaxed and can be damaged in various ways. Likewise, under certain conditions, which we'll come to in a moment, that which is imagined can induce us to undertake harmful activities, negatively impacting the well-being of others and the systems they depend on. So I'll focus on some of our dominant fantasies, the bad mental models shaping our worldview, and I use "our" very generally, so please forgive me, and then get to some of the contemporary conditions within which they operate. So here again are two foundational fantasies from which so many others are spawned. Acting on these, we end up creating the very dangers we fear. Take, for instance, the notion of the self-made man, a fixed, independent entity, homo clausus, which corresponds to the illusion of the fixed qualities of separate others, of their inherent goodness or badness, and the corresponding notions of friends or enemies, us and them. And then there's still the standard economic model, the circular flow diagram, representing the delusion that goods and services come from nowhere and go nowhere. They have zero inputs and outputs, defying all of the laws of basic physics. This model goes well with the fantastical idea that economic growth can and must continue forever. Like so many things we insist should never change, including our looks, our physical abilities, our favorite restaurant, and lots of other preferences we have about the world. These are a few examples of the most egregious fantasies that keep us behaving in ways that create great harm for ourselves and others. So, for instance, it's not that many steps down the line from a fantasy of a disembodied economy to excessive resource extraction, waste production, and the externalization of the ecological, social, and personal costs of all of that. Of course, collectively held fantasies, collectively acted on, have a significant impact, and especially because the sprawling and densely structured patterns of social bonds and the technologies, one aspect of biophysical conditions through which we operate, both of those expand the reach of our activities so we can understand how those impacts are extended, amplified, and multiplied. So, of course, Each of these steps is a huge topic unto itself. I recognize that, with lots of layers and so many approaches to studying and understanding them. But seeing them together from this vantage point shows how a theoretical framework grounded in biophysical reality sheds some light on the relationship between how we think and our impacts in the world. Using this framework as a guide, we could also move our inquiry in the opposite direction, starting with impacts and tracing their origins back through these processes. Take ecological overshoot, for example, or any of the specific dangers that emerge from it: biodiversity loss, climate change, soil degradation, and the like. Situating any of these impacts in the framework prompts us to ask about the practices and activities behind them, largely the individual and collective expressions of what is widely taken to be normal. Tracing them back to these, we'd likely find particular land use practices, energy uses, production and consumption practices, and the methods of transporting ourselves and our stuff around the world, among other things. Now, this is the entry point where much problem-solving attention gets focused, and certainly there are interventions to be made at this level. But in looking further to the deeper causes of these, we find much greater points of greater leverage. So viewed within their larger context, we see that these collective expressions are not random. These activities are oriented, rather, by a certain kind of habitus, with certain shared mental models, like the separateness I mentioned, perceptions of normal in terms of home size, material goods, what's attractive or not, and embodied social learning, what tastes good, what just feels right, what's in our muscle memory, and so on. Of course, we don't magically absorb these ideas. They are learned by way of explicit and implicit conditioning, naturally occurring within the existing figurational and biophysical conditions into which we're born, develop, and operate. And I think that's one of the great benefits of this framework, is that it encourages a focus on the conditions giving rise to the impacts of interest. This points us toward powerful interventions with long-term effects, rather than just tilting at presently manifesting symptoms. It suggests, for example, that in the effort to achieve the changes deemed desirable or necessary, so whether we're talking about energy or other kinds of resources we need to consume less of, or activities we need to do more of, whatever it is, it suggests that reconfiguring the patterns of functional interdependence is key. It not only affects how we do what we do now, but over time, it alters habitus, the sense of normal that is so crucial for being able to sustain the kinds of activities needed to achieve the desired impacts or changes in them. Of course, having this perspective doesn't make targeted social change easy, but having a more systematic understanding of these processes at least gives us a fighting chance. And getting to the final point, it also makes it possible to understand why, in an age of information and science and reason, when accumulated knowledge should help us know better in many cases, or at least allow us to remain curious and capable of robust discussion, why we're seeing a shift toward greater reliance on fantasy and less tolerance for disagreement and uncertainty. And, incidentally, in the US, this is happening on both sides of the cultural divide. And I think this is because, in principle, even if all the knowledge needed to reach a more sound conclusion about a given issue might exist, in practice, there are reasons why that's difficult to accomplish. Reasons that become clear when we pay attention to the whole situation and longer-term processes, including the conditions within which we go about the work of parsing information and drawing conclusions. So I'm going to name a few of those after I take a sip. So one fundamental condition is our universal need as humans to understand our world And we'll seek that. Our brains will go on developing schemas unconsciously to make sense of things, whether they're accurate or not. And thanks to the suite of cognitive biases we come equipped with, they're often not. So there's that. There's also the fact that the sheer scale of impacts we're seeing are global in scope and reach far into the future, making them impossible for us ordinary people to see from where we stand. Add to that the enormous complexity of the problems themselves, with numerous contributing causes and human activities, making it difficult to comprehend what's really going on and way easier to settle for a simpler answer. Finally, if we recognize these problems as highly consequential, this adds a strong emotional component that drives people to want to reach some understanding even more desperately, whether it's right or not. But where the framework really shines, I think, is in how it highlights the role of figurations in all of this, and the way they point our attention to the effects of increasingly dense and complicated patterns of bonds of social interdependence. So because I don't have any such visual representations of contemporary figurations, although I'd love to be able to do that someday, I'm going to use art here to make the point. You're looking at part of an installation called Galaxies Forming Along Filaments, like droplets along the strands of a spider's web. I had to read it out loud because it's such a cool title. Creative works like this strike me as beautiful stand-ins for contemporary figurations, which have grown rapidly, even more dense and sprawling, with highly uneven power differentials, embedding us in webs of social relations of unmatched complexity. This one, called In Silence, has more meaning than I can explain here, but to me, it nicely represents the way that masses of people today can be and commonly are bound to certain entities, and through that, to one another. And what it might look like if we could see those linkages. This is a very impressive work of art, I think. Here's the same work from a different angle. Feast your eyes on that. So, depicting the complexity of figurations here, these are the conditions today shaping our habitus, channeling our activities, and ultimately giving rise to the impacts we're having. In them, where the knowledge distributed is vast, highly specialized, and fragmented, where technologies allow us to move words and ideas and materials around in quantities and speeds never before seen, where channels of communication have also become increasingly fragmented, especially in the news and marketing, where they no longer target demographic categories, but individuals at particular moments in cyber-tracked time, where bots and algorithms and fake accounts can amplify the messages people get, elevating the most fantastical by prioritizing those which provoke the most intense emotions. And recall our fictional creature, where sophisticated technologies can make fantasy look like reality, making it all the harder to discern fact from fiction. Deep fake of a jackalope or the real thing? You decide. So these are some of the extraordinary conditions within which many of the world's people today are growing up and making their way, with inevitable and profound implications for habitus and the perceptions and activities it orients. For instance, living in such a highly pluralistic, mobile, and globalized society with the aforementioned technologies means that the average person is linked to and hearing from more people and social entities in a given day than ever before in the history of humanity, which brings corresponding changes in the proportionate time spent with and the overall influence of those people and entities. For example, statistics vary, but they say adults in the US spend an average of 2 to 4 hours on their phones every day. Children ages 8 to 12 spend about 4 to 6 hours a day on screens. Teens, average of 9 hours a day. That's a lot of time hearing from random people and influencers on social media, and interacting with imaginary characters like this and in games. Displacing time traditionally spent with parents, children, friends, neighbors, employers, and doing other meaningful activities. And to your original point, it's like bowling alone on steroids, right? So one result of this, I contend, is a cacophony of schemas and a habitus based on an unprecedented multiplicity of conditioning influences, which, among other potential effects on identity and well-being, lends itself really well to a choose your own explanation rather than a reliable and shared understanding. Okay, phew, that was a lot of stuff. I hope that what I just said gives enough of a hint of how this framework offers valuable insights to the question of why people today might be turning to fantasy more readily than we might expect. To wrap up, in a situation where people mostly can't see the forces that they feel pushing and pulling on them in different ways, we remain unclear about how our life together works, blind to the human origins of our dangers, generally confused about how social change happens. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons hanging on my office door. But because of our need to understand, this confusion only adds to the distress, motivating us even more to fill in the gaps however we can, even with really bad explanations if necessary, or just ignore it. Either way, we are left unable to effectively respond to problems, thereby perpetuating and often making them worse in a reinforcing feedback loop, escalating the dangers to humans and to so much that we care about. As Elias observed, for the time being, the course of humanity in dealing with disasters brought about by humans themselves appears to have been arrested in a condition not unlike that which, for thousands of years, also prevailed in the case of dangers resulting from non-human nature. He adds, however, that the real explanation for such disasters lies in an ongoing, self-perpetuating social process without absolute beginning, though possibly with an end. As we saw earlier, Elias compares these social processes to a web, and I think that is an excellent metaphor. In order to orient ourselves in this web, we first need to learn to see it. So I want to close by just sharing a few photos I took a couple of years ago on the back deck of my house. There was this really beautiful spider web and spider, and for whatever reason, I just felt compelled to capture it. And I'm no photographer, as you might guess. But what I discovered, and our deck was very cluttered, so it was difficult to get the right angle in the right spot. So as I moved around and tried to get this picture, I discovered that from different angles, I could see more or less of what was actually there. So in this picture, it actually looks as though the spider is suspended in nothing. This made me think of how, from a certain perspective, with a badly flawed worldview as our lens, we too cannot see the substrate of our lives. So just bringing us back to where we started, as a reminder, our task is to render this web visible so that people can orient themselves within it, understand it better, ultimately, so that we can increase our control over it to some degree. At present, I would argue that given the current perspective most people hold in the dominant worldviews, shaped as it is by our dominant fantasies, this social web remains opaque to most, though this is changing. So in the same way that a shift in my position to take this picture revealed a little bit more of what was there, certain developments in knowledge have shifted our perspective, revealing some aspects of the underlying structures of human social life, which is so wonderful. Giving us a different vantage point, I argue, Elias's work and the framework developed from it allow us to see even more of the web, including the biophysical conditions it rests on and is made of, which in this case, it's resting on a railing and a grill and a house. So the web is connected to all of these things. And importantly, it brings into sharper relief the dynamic living nature of our inherent interdependence. I don't know how well you can make it out, but the sunlight and the breeze, you can kind of see how, acting on different individual strands influences the whole web. It's the movement goes throughout the web. So I'm with Elias in thinking that we could learn to better minimize our own dangers, perhaps in time into some of them, if we were to finally get clearer on how our life together works. Of course, there's no guarantee that we would, but the proposed framework in assembling seemingly disparate knowledge from across the disciplines to finally put us in our place at least makes it possible, improving our odds just a bit. The work I've been up to, slow and humble as it is meant to contribute in some way to bringing that possibility into being. So thank you.